and welcome to our series, Poetry for the Soul, Part 11 of 12. I think that one possible definition of our modern culture is that it is one in which 9/10 of our intellectuals can't read any poetry. Randall Jarrell, American poet, 1914 to 1965. Journalism wishes to tell what it is that has happened everywhere, as though the same things had happened for every man. Poetry wishes to say what it is like for any man to be himself in the presence of a particular occurrence, as though only he were alone there. Archibald MacLeish, American poet and critic, 1892 to 1982. It is the artists that create the poetry, the painting, the music, the philosophy, and the love. And every lover cherishes them. Will Durant, American writer and historian, 1885 to 1981. Any healthy man can go without food for 2 days, but not without poetry. Charles Baudelaire. Poetry is the synthesis of hyacinths and biscuits. Carl Sandburg. If we can discover the meaning in the trilling of a frog, perhaps we may understand why it is for us not merely noise, but a song of poetry and emotion. Poetry is adolescence fermented and thus preserved. Jose Ortega y Gasset. The fact that poetry is not of the slightest economic or political importance, that it has no attachment to any of the powers that control the modern world, may set it free to do the only thing that in this age it can do, to keep the neglected parts. Graham Huff. And Sylvia Plath. For me, poetry is an evasion of the real job of writing prose. Well, I don't look on poetry as closed works. I feel they're going on all the time in my head, and I occasionally snip off a length. John Ashbery. To feel most beautifully alive means to be reading something beautiful, ready always to apprehend, in the flow of language, the sudden flash of poetry. Poetry is rather an approach to things, to life, than it is typographical production. Language is fossil poetry. Ralph Waldo Emerson. In Australia, not reading poetry is the national pastime. Phyllis McGinley. Philosophy offers the rather cold consolation that perhaps we and our planet do not actually exist. Religion presents the contradictory and scarcely more comforting thought that we exist, but that we cannot hope to get anywhere until we cease to exist. Alcohol, in attempting to resolve the contradiction, produces vivid patterns of truth which vanish like snow in the morning sun and cannot be recalled. The revelations of poetry are as wonderful as a comet in the skies and as mysterious. Love, which was once believed to contain the answer, we now know to be nothing more than an inherited behavior pattern. James Thurber, 1894-1961. If food is poetry, is not poetry also food? Joyce Carol Oates. There is only beauty, and it has only one perfect expression: poetry. All the rest is a lie, except for those who live by the body, love, and that love of the mind, friendship. For me, poetry takes the place of love, because it is enamored of itself, and because its sensual delight falls back deliciously in my soul. Stephen Mallarmé. Poetry is the exquisite expression of exquisite expressions. Unknown. Bette Midler, famous singer, born in 1945, wrote, "Rap is poetry set to music, but to me, it's like a jackhammer." Television excites me because it seems to be the last stamping ground of poetry, the last place where I hear women's hair rhapsodically described, women's faces acclaimed in ode-like language. Ben Hecht. American film writer, novelist, and playwright, 1893-1964. Such is the role of poetry. It unveils in the strict sense of the word. It lays bare, under a light which shakes off torpor, the surprising things which surround us, and which our senses record mechanically. Jean Cocteau, 1889-1963. A visual experience is vitalizing, whereas to write great poetry, to draw continuously on one's inner life, is not merely exhausting, it is to keep alight a consuming fire. Kenneth Clark. For poetry, there exists neither large countries nor small. Its domain is in the heart of all men. Georgios Seferis. I'll be reading some of his poetry in time. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. This is just a part of W.H. Auden's all that is worth remembering of life is the poetry of it. William Hazlitt. In poetry, you must love the words, the ideas, and the images and rhythms with all your capacity to love anything at all. Wallace Stevens. You arrive at truth through poetry. I arrive at poetry through truth. Joseph Joubert. Poetry is the suggestion by the imagination of noble grounds for the noble emotions. John Ruskin. Poetry, with all its obscurity, has a more general as well as a more powerful dominion over the passions than the art of painting. Edmund Burke. Poetry is simply the most beautiful, impressive, and widely effective mode of saying things. Matthew Arnold. Nobody, I think, ought to read poetry or look at pictures or statues which cannot find a great deal more in them than the poet and artist has actually expressed. Nathaniel Hawthorne. Anticipating that most poetry will be worse than carrying heavy luggage through O'Hare Airport, the public, to its loss, reads very little of it. Russell Baker. By its very looseness, by its way of evoking rather than defining, suggesting rather than saying, English is a magnificent vehicle for emotional poetry. Max Beerbohm. One merit of poetry few persons will deny. It says more, and in few words, than prose. Voltaire. Poetry is an art, and chief of the fine art, the easiest to dabble in, the hardest in which to reach true excellence. Thank you.